We're going to go ahead and replace our passenger side CV axle. It's located right behind your passenger wheel, connecting your wheel hub to your transmission. Using our 22mm socket, we're going to go ahead, loosen, and remove our lug nuts. Remove the wheel and set it aside. On the back side of our brake caliper here, you're going to find two 19mm bolts. I want to go ahead and loosen these here. Now the bottom one we're going to loosen and remove. The top one we're going to loosen and take out almost all the way. Now before you remove this bolt here, you want to go ahead and you want to get a brake caliper hook or hang tool, because we want to support this caliper. Once we remove it, we're going to hang the caliper and the bracket off of our strut spring to hold it up out of the way. Hold the caliper in place. You don't want that to fall and cause premature pressure on this flex hose. Now, if your caliper is stuck in place, you can use a little pry bar and go inside here and loosen up your brake pad a little bit. Ours is coming off nice and easy. You want to go ahead and grab your brake rotor, remove it, and set it aside. On the back side of our strut, we have our ABS wire right here in a bracket. There's a 10mm bolt holding that in place. Let's go ahead, loosen, and remove that bolt. On our outer tie rod here, there's going to be a nut with a cotter pin. I'm going to use a pair of pliers here. I want to try and straighten out the legs here on our cotter pin. And try and remove this. You use the pliers as leverage here and just kind of pinch that cotter pin and work that out. Now, cotter pins are a one-time use, so you are going to want to source a replacement cotter pin for this. I'm going to use a 17mm socket. I'm going to go ahead and loosen this nut. Now we're going to spin that off, but we're going to put that back on just a few threads. We're going to use this as a capture nut so we can go ahead and disconnect our outer tie rod end. We want to go ahead and strike our knuckle here, and this should release our outer tie rod. Now that we have our tie rod loose, we can go ahead and remove our nut. Pull out the tie rod. I'm just going to put that nut back on there. Now on our spindle nut here, we have a dimpled edge right here to lock that nut in place. I'm going to use a punch, and we're going to try and open this up. Using a 36mm socket, loosen and remove your axle nut. Next, we want to go ahead and loosen our nuts on our strut bolts to the knuckle. This is going to be a 24mm, or you can use a 15/16. I'm going to put our ratchet on here with our socket. You might need a breaker bar, or you can use your impact tools if necessary. Now we're going to spin off the nuts here, but we're going to keep the bolts in place for now. You may experience the bolt itself spinning with the nut if it gets stuck. Just use a pair of pliers or another 24mm on the other side to hold that in place. When we remove these two bolts here, the knuckle will be loose. So you want to be able to have some type of securing strap to anchor the knuckle, maybe to the strut, just to hold this kind of in place. And we're going to be putting the strap on and off so that we can go ahead and flex this out and remove our CV axle. We just don't want this to pull out and start pulling on our lower ball joint and causing any other type of damage. Let's go ahead and tap these bolts out. Rock that strut and that knuckle around, pull the bolts out. There's a second one. Now this isn't going to just fall out. You just got to kind of be prepared for it. You might need a pry bar. And there, ours goes right there. And just something simple. Spring, and maybe on the knuckle itself somewhere. There we go. Now at this point here, our axle is kind of stuck in here. You could use a punch or just go ahead and work that axle free. You can see that just went inside the hub. Come around the back side here, and let's go ahead and wiggle this axle out of the knuckle. You can see our knuckle is starting to pull away now. Just kind of push that axle off to the side there. And I'm going to go ahead and anchor this on one of the studs here just to give it a little extra support there. With this free, I want to go ahead and focus our attention to the inboard part of the CV axle. On the inside joint of our CV axle, there is a metal dust cover right here. I'm going to use a pry bar. Going to get up there and put the edge of that right between there and just tap it. Tap it with a hammer on the back side. There we go. You can see that that little shield's separated here. Give it a couple more taps. CV axle is now disconnected from our intermediate shaft. So now that we have this separated, go ahead and work that out. I'm going to go ahead and grab the whole CV axle and pull that right off of our intermediate shaft. Go ahead and grab that axle. There we go. Good, slide that out. Right here where your intermediate shaft is, there's going to be a rubber seal. You want to go ahead and inspect that, check for any damage, tears, or anything like that. If it is worn like that there, you want to go ahead and replace it now before you install the new axle. Now we went ahead and put some grease on the inside of our CV axle here. We're going to line this up with our intermediate shaft. And we'll try and slide that onto the splines here a little bit. Now at this point here, our CV axle is on the intermediate shaft and is resting on the lock ring that is in there. So now what I need to do is use my dead blow hammer, and I'm going to hit the outside of the CV axle on the end and pop that in and on. Okay, now we have the axle completely seated. Let's go ahead and remove the axle nut off the end. Let's go ahead and set that aside. And what we're going to do next is we're going to apply some grease to the splines here. Once we have the grease on there, let's go ahead and we're going to feed the axle up into the back of our bearing. Go ahead and we can loosen our strap, set that aside, and we're going to manipulate that knuckle, feed this around, and put the shaft into the wheel bearing. Once the axle comes through the wheel bearing hub unit, you can just throw that spindle nut on there for now, the axle nut. Next is to get our strut itself kind of lined up on here. Let's go ahead and grab our two bolts here, and we'll get those popped into the strut and the knuckle. At this point here, you can see that our knuckle holes are not lining up with our strut. You can try and wiggle this around. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a pry tool here, put this through the strut hole in our knuckle, and you can see I'm just using this as leverage to bring this down to line it up. When doing this here, you can get the upper bolt to line up. Prying and wiggle, get that big bolt in on the top. Then you can go ahead, get that lower one lined up. At this point here, you just got to push and pull, and there you go. Let's go ahead and get those two nuts installed on those bolts. Let's go ahead and get those nuts installed here. I'm just going to go ahead and thread those down as far as I can. Now you can go ahead and use a wire brush, or if you have a wire wheel machine, clean the threads on your bolts before installation. We did put some anti-seize compound on the threads. You can grab your outer tie rod, I'm gonna remove that nut that we popped back on there. Get that installed. And just go ahead and thread that nut down as far as you can. We're going to apply some anti-seize compound to this here. Once we have that anti-seize compound on there, let's go ahead and get that nut threaded on. I'm going to thread that down as far as I can by hand. Next, grab your ABS bracket here. And we have our little bolt. I'm going to line this up and get that installed. At this point here, you want to install your brake rotor. Now you want to pay attention to where the threaded holes are. If your particular brake rotor had those screws that hold your rotor in place, you want to pay attention to the position of your rotor. So you want to make sure that the recessed hole here lines up beside the stud. Now our particular vehicle doesn't have them, so it's not critical to us. Once you have your rotor in place, go ahead and grab that brake caliper that we had nested up here nice. Remove that hook. Swing this around. I want to slide this into place. Once we have this in its area, let's go ahead and install the 2 bolts on the back side on the caliper bracket. Let's go ahead and install your bolt here. You just want to get that bolt started a few threads. Once that's in, let's go ahead and line up the upper one here. Get that lined up and get this started a few threads. Now that caliper and bracket is held in place, let's go ahead and grab our ratchet and socket and we'll get those snug down. So you can torque our caliper bracket bolts to 100 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and tighten down and torque our strut bolts to knuckle to 156 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and snug down the bolt here for our ABS wire. And once that's snugged down, you're good to go. Let's get torque down our tie rod nut here to 44 foot-pounds. Go ahead and take your cotter pin, slide that through. Grab the upper portion. We're going to fold that right on over. And we're just going to use our snips here and cut off the excess. Let's go ahead and tighten down our axle nut. I'm going to go ahead and install a couple lug nuts here. Going to rotate this here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a pry bar here. We're going to spin this around so we get some leverage. We're going to go ahead and torque down our axle nut to 242 foot-pounds. Go ahead and remove that pry bar and remove the lug nuts. Once we have our axle nut torqued, I want to go ahead and dimple the nut into the axle right here. So you can use a punch or a chisel tip. Just go ahead and I'm going to tap this in. Dimpled in, you're locked into place. At this point here, we can go ahead and install your wheels and tires. Be sure to go ahead and pump the brakes and make sure that your caliper is completely compressed before you put the vehicle in drive or reverse. Let's go ahead and install your wheel. Once that's on, install all of your lug nuts. We'll snug those down and then we'll lower the vehicle and we'll torque all the lug nuts. Let's go ahead and torque our lug nuts down to 95 foot-pounds.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.